Some love stories are meant to be, but others? They defy every rule, every expectation. Imagine a powerful duke, bound by duty, and a humble maid, trapped by her place in society. What happens when their worlds collide in a way no one ever expected? Betrayal, secrets, and a love that should have never begun, yet cannot be denied. But here's the question. Can love truly conquer all, or will fate tear them apart forever? Watch until the end to find out. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what makes you love these kinds of stories? The grand chandelier sparkled above the ballroom, casting a warm, golden glow across the sea of swirling gowns and polished shoes. The air was thick with anticipation, perfumes mingling with the faint scent of candle wax and the hum of the string quartet that filled the cavernous space. Beneath her borrowed mask, Margaret felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her chest like an anchor. This was madness. She had no business being here, but Lady Amelia had insisted. "No one will ever know," Amelia had whispered with a mischievous grin, fastening the delicate mask over Margaret's face. But Margaret knew better. Secrets had a way of unraveling. And tonight, hers felt as fragile as the silk dress that clung to her borrowed form. Across the room, Edward, the Duke of Wexley, stood with an air of quiet authority. His sharp eyes scanned the ballroom, catching glimpses of vibrant laughter and fleeting glances exchanged behind elaborate masks. He hated these events, empty formalities drenched in pretense. But tonight, something felt different. There was an electric tension in the air, as if the fates themselves had conspired to weave together lives that should never intertwine. His gaze faltered when it landed on her, a figure standing at the edge of the crowd, her posture betraying both elegance and uncertainty. The curve of her lips, even beneath the mask, seemed to beckon him. Who was she? And why did she seem so out of place among the peacocks and chatter? Margaret felt the Duke's eyes on her before she dared to meet them. Her heart lurched as their gazes locked. She had heard of Edward Wexley, the brooding Duke who commanded both respect and curiosity from the ton. His presence was magnetic, his reputation intimidating. Yet, as he strode toward her, she couldn't bring herself to move. She should flee. She had to flee. But her feet betrayed her, rooted to the ground as if the universe itself willed her to stay. "Forgive me," Edward began, his voice smooth and rich like velvet. "But I don't believe we've met." Margaret's breath caught. Up close, his piercing gaze was even more disarming. She curtsied instinctively, her hands trembling as she clutched the folds of her dress. "No, Your Grace," she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. "We haven't." The orchestra began a waltz, its melody winding through the air like a spell, and Edward extended his hand. "May I have this dance?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost coaxing. Margaret hesitated, her pulse hammering in her ears. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to refuse, to slip away before the situation spiraled out of control. But something about the warmth in his gaze, the way he seemed to truly see her, made her nod. Wordlessly, she placed her hand in his, and he led her onto the dance floor. The world seemed to blur as they moved together, their steps effortlessly in sync. Edward's hand rested lightly on her waist, his touch steady and grounding. Margaret's mind raced. What was she doing? How had she ended up here, in the arms of a man so far removed from her world? Yet as their eyes met again, the questions dissolved. For the first time in years she felt alive. The waltz swelled and they spun together, the room tilting as if they were the only two people in existence. But reality came crashing back as the music faded. Margaret's pulse quickened as the enormity of the moment dawned on her. She had let herself be swept away, and now she was dangerously close to being discovered. "Thank you, Your Grace," she murmured, stepping back and lowering her gaze. Edward frowned, sensing her retreat. "You're leaving already?" he asked, his tone laced with disappointment. Margaret's throat tightened. She couldn't risk staying any longer. "I must," she said quickly, her voice trembling. Before he could respond, she turned and disappeared into the crowd. Edward stood frozen, a strange ache settling in his chest as he watched her vanish. He had danced with countless women at events like this, yet none had ever left him feeling so unmoored. She was unlike anyone he'd met, a mystery wrapped in grace and vulnerability. He vowed silently to find her again, no matter how long it took. Meanwhile, Margaret slipped through the back corridors of the estate, her heart pounding with a mix of exhilaration and dread. She yanked off the mask, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she reached the small room she shared with the other maids. The dress, now wrinkled from the evening's events, felt like a betrayal against everything she stood for. She hastily removed it, folding it with care before slipping back into her plain work clothes. Staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror, she barely recognized the woman who had captivated a duke. Her hands trembled as she clutched the mask to her chest. What had she done? She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. If anyone discovered the truth, that she, a mere servant, had dared to waltz with the Duke of Wexley, it would mean humiliation, dismissal, or worse. She had to bury this memory, lock it away where no one could find it. But as she lay in her narrow cot that night, staring at the ceiling, the memory of Edward's touch lingered like a ghost. His voice, his gaze, the way he had looked at her as if she were the only person in the room. It was all too vivid, too real. And for the first time in her life, Margaret allowed herself to dream of a world where such things were possible. A world where a duke could fall in love with a maid. The morning sun filtered through the heavy drapes of Wexley Manor, casting golden beams across the polished floors. Margaret moved silently through the drawing room, dusting shelves and rearranging books, her thoughts still swirling with the events of the previous night. She couldn't shake the image of Edward, his piercing eyes, the warmth of his hand on hers, the way his voice had seemed to wrap around her like a gentle embrace. It was madness, pure madness, to allow herself even a sliver of hope. Men like him didn't fall for women like her. She was a maid, an invisible cog in the machinery of the estate, nothing more. Her heart jolted when the door creaked open. Lady Amelia entered, her delicate slippers making barely a sound on the carpet. Margaret straightened immediately, clutching her dusting cloth as if it were a lifeline. Amelia's sharp gaze settled on her, a knowing smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "You were magnificent last night," she whispered, her tone equal parts teasing and conspiratorial. Margaret's cheeks burned. "My lady, please," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "If anyone finds out—" Amelia waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, relax, Margaret. No one suspects a thing. And besides, it's not every day one gets to captivate a duke." Margaret felt a sharp pang in her chest at those words. Captivate? Hardly. Whatever fleeting connection she and Edward had shared was born of the anonymity of the masks. If he knew her real identity, the spell would be broken in an instant. She bit her lip, her voice trembling as she spoke. "It was a mistake. I should never have gone." Amelia tilted her head, studying Margaret with an almost amused curiosity. "And yet you did. Why, I wonder?" Margaret couldn't answer. How could she explain the pull she'd felt, the unspoken yearning that had drawn her to the ballroom, to Edward? As Margaret returned to her duties, Edward paced the length of his study, his thoughts consumed by the mysterious woman from the ball. He replayed their brief interaction over and over in his mind, searching for clues, anything that might help him uncover her identity. There had been something in her eyes, something unguarded and real, unlike the polished facades he was used to encountering in society. He couldn't let it go. He wouldn't. Calling for his steward, Edward began to inquire discreetly about the guests who had attended the ball. The task proved frustratingly futile. No one seemed to know anything about her. By midday, Edward found himself wandering the halls of the manor, his thoughts restless. As he turned a corner, he nearly collided with Margaret, who was carrying a tray of tea meant for Lady Amelia. The impact sent the tray wobbling precariously, and Margaret let out a startled gasp. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she stammered, lowering her gaze as she scrambled to steady the tray. Edward reached out instinctively, his hand brushing hers as he helped her regain control. The brief contact sent an unexpected jolt through him, though he couldn't quite place why. Margaret's heart thundered in her chest as she stepped back, her hands trembling. He didn't recognize her. Of course he didn't. Why would he? She was dressed plainly, her hair tucked under a modest cap. Nothing like the vision he had seen the night before. And yet there was something in his expression, a flicker of curiosity, as if he felt a distant echo of familiarity. "You're new here, aren't you?" Edward asked, his voice steady but laced with interest. Margaret swallowed hard, keeping her gaze firmly fixed on the ground. "I've been here a few months, Your Grace." Edward nodded, though his eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary. There was something about her, an air of quiet grace that tugged at his thoughts. But before he could say more, a voice called out from down the hall. "Edward!" Lady Amelia's voice rang with impatience, pulling him away. With a final glance at Margaret, Edward turned and strode off, leaving her standing there, clutching the tray like it was her last anchor to reality. Margaret exhaled shakily once he was gone, her knees threatening to give way beneath her. That brief interaction had been too close, too dangerous. She couldn't afford to draw his attention. Not now, not ever. As the day wore on, Margaret buried herself in her work, doing everything in her power to avoid crossing paths with Edward again. But the memory of his voice, the brief touch of his hand, lingered like a ghost, haunting her every thought. That evening, Edward found himself seated in the grand dining hall, surrounded by the usual chatter of his family and their guests. Yet, his thoughts were miles away, drifting back to the mysterious woman from the ball. His frustration grew with each passing moment. How could someone make such a profound impression and then vanish without a trace? He needed answers, and he needed them soon. As the conversation around the table shifted to trivial matters, Edward's mind began to form a plan. Meanwhile, Margaret sat in the servants' quarters, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. She stared at the table in front of her, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The memory of Edward's gaze, his voice, his touch, it was all too much. She couldn't let herself be swept up in a fantasy, not when the stakes were so high. She had come to Wexley Manor for a reason, a purpose that went far beyond the fleeting allure of a dance. But as the hours stretched into the night, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully constructed world was beginning to crack. The barriers she had built to protect herself, to keep her secrets hidden, were slowly crumbling. And Edward, with his piercing eyes and unrelenting curiosity, was the force threatening to break through them entirely. The morning came with a heavy mist clinging to the grounds of Wexley Manor, casting a somber haze over the estate. Margaret stood by the window of the servants' quarters, her fingers brushing the cold glass as she gazed out at the gray landscape. Her mind was a tempest. Every step she took in the manor felt like walking on the edge of a cliff, one wrong move away from disaster. Last night she had seen the look in Edward's eyes, the flicker of recognition, the curiosity that she feared would unravel everything. She knew she had to remain invisible, to blend back into the shadows where she belonged, yet the memory of their dance refused to let her go. Across the manor, Edward sat in his study, his fingers tapping absently against the polished wood of his desk. He was a man accustomed to control, to having answers at his fingertips. But this mystery was unraveling him. Every conversation with his staff and family had yielded nothing. The guests from the ball seemed oblivious to the presence of his masked muse, and the more time passed, the more her absence gnawed at him. She had to be here, somewhere, hidden in plain sight. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was closer than he realized, like a whisper on the wind. Determined to take action, Edward summoned his steward and issued instructions for a small gathering to be held in 2 days. The pretense was a luncheon for select guests from the ball, but Edward's true intent was to draw out the woman who had left him captivated. If she had attended before, surely she would come again. As the steward left to make arrangements, Edward leaned back in his chair, his mind replaying the fleeting moments he had shared with her. He could still feel the warmth of her hand in his, the way her eyes had held 1,000 secrets. He vowed to uncover every one of them. Meanwhile, Margaret found herself assigned to tasks that brought her dangerously close to Edward's presence. Lady Amelia, ever perceptive, seemed to enjoy testing the limits of her composure, offering subtle nudges that forced her to confront the Duke more often than Margaret would have liked. That morning, she had been tasked with delivering a tray of correspondence to Edward's study. Her hands trembled as she knocked on the heavy oak door, her pulse racing when his deep voice called for her to enter. Edward looked up from his desk as Margaret stepped inside, her gaze fixed firmly on the tray she carried. "Your Grace," she murmured, setting the tray down carefully. Her voice was steady, but Edward noticed the slight tremor in her hands. Something about her demeanor struck him as familiar, though he couldn't place why. "Thank you," he said, his tone polite but laced with curiosity. Margaret turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Wait." She froze, her breath hitching as she slowly turned back to face him. Edward studied her for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. "Have we met before?" he asked, the question falling into the silence between them like a stone into a still pond. Margaret's heart raced. She forced herself to meet his gaze, though it took every ounce of courage she had. "No, Your Grace," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Edward nodded slowly, though the answer didn't satisfy him. There was something in her eyes, something that tugged at the edge of his memory. But before he could press further, Margaret curtsied and slipped out of the room, her chest heaving as she leaned against the wall outside. The rest of the day passed in a blur for Margaret, each moment a careful dance of avoidance and duty. She knew she couldn't keep this up forever. Edward was too perceptive, too determined. She had to stay out of his path, at least until the gathering he had planned was over. The thought of another event, another opportunity for their worlds to collide, filled her with both dread and longing. Part of her ached to see him again, to feel the way he had made her feel during their dance. But the rational part of her, the part that had kept her safe all these years, knew that any further interaction could spell disaster. That evening, as the household quieted, Margaret stole away to the old attic, a place she had discovered early in her employment at Wexley Manor. It was a sanctuary of sorts, a place where she could be alone with her thoughts. She lit a small lamp and settled onto a dusty trunk, pulling a faded leather-bound book from beneath a loose floorboard. It was her mother's journal, the only connection she had to the woman who had disappeared so many years ago. Margaret's fingers traced the worn pages as she read the familiar lines. Her mother had worked in this very manor, serving the Wexley family until the day she vanished without explanation. The journal held fragments of her life, glimpses of the joy and sorrow she had experienced here. Margaret had come to Wexley Manor not just to find work, but to uncover the truth about her mother's fate. And yet, the closer she came to answers, the more complicated her situation became. As she read, a particular passage caught her eye, one she hadn't noticed before. Her mother had written about an incident involving the previous Duke of Wexley, Edward's father. The details were vague, but there was a sense of tension, of something unsaid. Margaret's breath caught as she pieced together the implications. Could her mother's disappearance have been tied to the Wexley family? The thought sent a chill down her spine. The lamp flickered, casting shadows across the attic as Margaret closed the journal, her mind racing. She knew she had to tread carefully. Whatever secrets lay buried in this manor, they were intertwined with her own. And Edward, unknowingly, was at the center of it all. The soft murmur of voices drifted through Wexley Manor as preparations for the upcoming luncheon gained momentum. The entire staff moved in a precise rhythm, polishing silver, arranging flowers, and ironing linens to perfection. Margaret worked quietly in the background, her mind preoccupied with the passage she had discovered in her mother's journal. The cryptic words haunted her. Promises made in shadows rarely see the light. What promise? And why did her mother's words carry an undertone of fear? Margaret's thoughts were interrupted when Lady Amelia appeared in the servants' quarters, her presence a rare occurrence. "Margaret," Amelia said with a smile that carried both warmth and mischief. "You're to accompany me at the luncheon tomorrow." Margaret froze, the cloth she had been using to clean a vase slipping from her hands. "My lady?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Amelia waved a hand dismissively. "It's a simple gathering, nothing grand. I'll need you to act as my companion. You've done it before. This is no different." Margaret felt a lump rise in her throat. She had been counting on staying far from the guests, avoiding any interaction that might expose her. "My lady, she began, but Amelia cut her off. "Nonsense, Margaret. You'll blend in perfectly. Besides, it's an informal affair. I won't take no for an answer." With that, Amelia swept out of the room, leaving Margaret staring after her in stunned silence. The next morning, the air in the manor was electric with anticipation. The dining room was transformed into a vision of understated elegance, with delicate floral arrangements adorning the long table and sunlight streaming through the tall windows. Edward entered the room, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. He was restless, his mind consumed by the hope that the mysterious woman from the ball might appear. He had hardly slept the night before, his thoughts an endless loop of her face, her voice, the way she had looked at him as if she were carrying the weight of 1,000 secrets. Margaret, dressed in a simple but elegant gown borrowed from Lady Amelia's wardrobe, stood at the edge of the room, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She felt like an imposter, every fiber of her being screaming that she didn't belong here. She had tied her hair back neatly, and Amelia had insisted she wear a touch of powder on her face. The transformation was subtle, but enough to make Margaret feel exposed, as if the mask she had worn for so long had been stripped away. Edward's gaze landed on her almost immediately. He froze, his heart skipping a beat as he took in the sight of her. There was something achingly familiar about her, something that tugged at the edges of his memory. He couldn't place it, but the feeling was undeniable. She looked up, and their eyes met across the room. For a moment, the world seemed to fall away, the chatter of the guests fading into nothing. Margaret quickly averted her gaze, her cheeks burning, but Edward couldn't look away. As the luncheon progressed, Edward found himself gravitating toward Margaret. He couldn't explain it, but there was an unspoken pull between them, a magnetic force he couldn't resist. During a lull in conversation, he approached her, his footsteps quiet but deliberate. "Miss," he began, his voice low and steady, "I don't believe we've been properly introduced." Margaret's breath caught, her pulse thundering in her ears. She kept her eyes fixed on the tablecloth, unable to meet his gaze. "I'm simply here to assist Lady Amelia, Your Grace," she replied, her voice soft but firm. Edward frowned slightly, sensing the walls she had built around herself. "You seem familiar," he said, his tone probing. "Have we met before?" Margaret's fingers tightened around the napkin in her lap. "I don't believe so, Your Grace," she lied, her voice betraying the faintest tremor. Edward studied her for a moment longer, his piercing gaze searching hers as if trying to unravel a puzzle. "Perhaps I'm mistaken," he said finally, though the doubt in his voice was clear. Margaret felt a wave of relief as he turned away, but it was short-lived. Lady Amelia, ever the observant matchmaker, noticed the interaction and couldn't help but intervene. "Edward," she called, a playful lilt in her voice. "You're interrogating poor Margaret. She's only here to keep me company, not to answer your endless questions." Edward raised an eyebrow, his curiosity only growing. "Margaret, is it?" he asked, his tone thoughtful. "Well, Margaret, I hope we'll have the chance to speak again." Margaret's heart sank as he walked away, his words hanging in the air like a promise. She could feel Amelia's gaze on her, a sly smile playing on her lips. "You handled that well," Amelia said softly, leaning closer. "But don't think for a moment that he's given up. Edward is nothing if not persistent." Margaret shot her a look, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "Why did you bring me here, my lady?" she asked, her voice low but edged with desperation. Amelia's smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet concern. "Because you deserve more than this," she said simply. "And perhaps he does too." The rest of the luncheon passed in a blur for Margaret, each moment an exercise in restraint. She avoided Edward's gaze, kept her responses polite but brief, and did everything in her power to remain unnoticed. But she could feel his eyes on her, could sense his presence like a shadow that refused to leave her side. When the guests began to disperse, Margaret slipped away, retreating to the safety of the servants' quarters. As she sat on her narrow cot that evening, her mother's journal clutched tightly in her hands, Margaret felt the weight of her situation pressing down on her. The lines between duty and desire, truth and deception, were growing blurrier by the day. She had come to Wexley Manor searching for answers, but instead, she had found questions she didn't know how to answer, and at the center of it all was Edward, a man who seemed determined to unravel her carefully guarded world. The ballroom gleamed under the glow of countless candles, their soft flickers reflecting off gilded mirrors and polished marble floors. Guests arrived in a stream of color and laughter, their fine silks and jewels a testament to their wealth and station. Margaret stood at the edge of the room, her breath shallow as she took in the grandeur of yet another gathering at Wexley Manor. She had thought the luncheon was the most dangerous position she could find herself in, but this ball, this glittering stage, was far worse. Lady Amelia, as insistent as ever, had once again convinced her to don a borrowed gown and pose as her companion. "You'll simply blend into the crowd," Amelia had said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "No one will pay you any mind." Margaret doubted that. Every moment in Edward's presence at the luncheon had felt like walking a tightrope over an abyss, and tonight, with the room alive with possibilities, she could feel the tension in the air like a string about to snap. Across the room, Edward stood near the grand staircase, his sharp gaze surveying the crowd. His dark suit was impeccably tailored, his presence commanding without effort. Yet, despite the hum of conversation around him, he was not listening. His thoughts were consumed by the woman who had evaded him since the first ball, the same woman he suspected had been seated mere feet from him during the luncheon. He felt her presence tonight before he even saw her, a tug at the edge of his consciousness. And when his eyes finally found her, dressed in soft hues that made her glow like a rare jewel, he felt his breath catch. Margaret didn't notice his approach at first. She had been carefully maneuvering through the crowd, staying close to Amelia and avoiding prolonged conversations. But then, as if drawn by an invisible thread, she turned, and there he was, moving toward her with the kind of deliberate intent that made her pulse quicken. Her first instinct was to retreat, to melt into the crowd and disappear. But his eyes locked onto hers, and she realized there would be no escape tonight. "Miss Margaret," Edward greeted her, his voice low and warm, carrying just enough formality to keep the interaction polite. Margaret curtsied, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Your Grace," she replied, keeping her gaze lowered. Edward studied her, his curiosity only deepening. "I was hoping we might share a dance," he said, his words more a statement than a question. Margaret's breath hitched. A dance? It was impossible. It was reckless. And yet, as she looked up and met his gaze, she found herself nodding. He extended his hand, and she hesitated for only a heartbeat before placing hers in his. The touch sent a shiver through her, and she prayed he couldn't feel the way her fingers trembled. Edward led her to the center of the floor as the musicians struck up a waltz. The room seemed to hold its breath as they began to move, their steps perfectly in sync. Margaret felt as if she were floating, the world narrowing to the space between them. "You intrigue me, Miss Margaret," Edward said softly, his voice barely audible over the music. Margaret's throat tightened. "I am not sure why, Your Grace," she replied, her tone carefully measured. Edward's lips curved into a faint smile. "Perhaps it is because you are unlike anyone else here. There's a sincerity in you, a quiet strength." His words sent a pang through her chest. If only he knew the truth. As they turned together, Margaret became acutely aware of the eyes watching them, the murmurs rippling through the crowd. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if every secret she carried was etched onto her skin for all to see. "Your Grace," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "this is highly inappropriate. People will talk." Edward's expression softened, and for a moment he looked almost boyish, stripped of the weight of his title. "Let them," he said simply, his gaze steady. The dance ended, and applause erupted around them, pulling Margaret from the fragile spell. She stepped back, her hand slipping from his, and curtsied again. "Thank you, Your Grace," she murmured, her voice tight. Before he could respond, she turned and disappeared into the crowd, her heart pounding as she made her way to the edge of the room. Edward remained where she had left him, his chest tightening with a strange mixture of frustration and admiration. She was a mystery, and he was determined to solve her. As the evening wore on, he found himself scanning the room for her, but she had vanished as if into thin air. It only deepened his resolve. Margaret, meanwhile, slipped away to a quiet corridor, her hands shaking as she leaned against the wall. She had been foolish to let herself dance with him, foolish to think she could hold on to the fragile facade she had built. The secrets she carried, about her mother, about herself, were a weight she could no longer bear. But she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't let Edward get any closer. That night, as the manor fell into silence, Margaret sat in the attic with her mother's journal. The words blurred before her eyes as tears threatened to fall. She felt trapped, caught between a past she couldn't escape and a future she couldn't allow herself to dream of. Her fingers traced the faded ink, her mother's words a painful reminder of the cost of truth. Edward, too, found no rest that night. He sat in his study, staring out into the darkness, his thoughts consumed by Margaret. There was something about her, something that called to him in a way he couldn't explain. He knew he was breaking every rule, defying every expectation placed upon him as a duke. But he couldn't stop himself. As dawn broke over Wexley Manor, both Edward and Margaret were left grappling with the same question. How far were they willing to go to uncover the truth about each other and about themselves? The morning air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth after a night of gentle rain. Margaret stood by the laundry line in the servants' courtyard, her hands deftly pinning freshly washed linens, but her mind was far from the mundane task. Her thoughts remained tangled in the events of the ball, in the way Edward's gaze had burned into hers, and the way his words had stirred something in her that she had fought so desperately to bury. She replayed their dance over and over in her mind, unable to suppress the mix of longing and dread that it evoked. The sound of footsteps on the cobblestones jolted her from her reverie, and she turned to see Lady Amelia approaching, her silk parasol resting lightly on her shoulder. "Margaret," Amelia called, her voice cheerful, though her sharp eyes missed nothing. "Come with me. We have much to discuss." Margaret's heart sank. Discussions with Lady Amelia rarely ended without some scheme that placed her in the very situations she wished to avoid. She hesitated, her hands still clutching a damp sheet, but Amelia was not one to be refused. Minutes later, Margaret found herself seated in Amelia's private parlor, a steaming cup of tea placed before her. Amelia settled into the chaise with a practiced grace, her gaze fixed on Margaret with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. "You've caught his attention, you know," Amelia said, her tone light but her meaning unmistakable. Margaret stiffened, her hands tightening around the cup. "My lady, Amelia held up a hand to silence her. "Don't deny it, Margaret. Anyone with eyes could see the way he looked at you during the ball." Margaret felt her cheeks burn as she stared down at the tea, her stomach churning with unease. "It was just a dance," she murmured, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. Amelia raised an eyebrow, a small smile playing on her lips. "Perhaps, but I've never seen Edward show such interest in anyone before. He's usually so detached." Amelia leaned forward slightly, her expression softening. "He's not as unfeeling as he seems, you know. There's more to him than the title and the duty." Margaret looked up, her heart aching with the weight of unspoken truths. "It doesn't matter," she said quietly. "Even if he did care, it would lead nowhere. We're from different worlds. I'm a servant, my lady, nothing more." Amelia tilted her head, studying Margaret with a look of quiet determination. "And yet, you've managed to touch something in him that no one else has. Don't underestimate that, Margaret. Sometimes, the heart doesn't care for titles or rules." As the day wore on, Edward found himself restless once more. He had spent the morning poring over estate documents in his study, but his mind was elsewhere. Margaret. Her name had become a refrain in his thoughts, a melody he couldn't shake. He recalled the way she had moved in his arms during their dance, the way her voice had trembled when she spoke to him, as though she carried the weight of 1,000 secrets. He needed to understand her, to unravel the mystery she represented. Summoning his steward, Edward made an unusual request. "Have the staff prepare the horses," he said. "I'll be riding out this afternoon, alone." The steward looked surprised but nodded obediently, leaving Edward to his thoughts. A ride would clear his mind, or so he hoped. He needed to sort through the growing storm of emotions that Margaret had stirred within him. Meanwhile, Margaret tried to busy herself with her tasks, but a sense of unease gnawed at her. She knew Edward's attention was dangerous, not because he meant her harm, but because it threatened the careful balance she had maintained since arriving at Wexley Manor. Her mother's journal felt heavier in her mind than ever, the cryptic words about the Wexley family and the secrets they held echoing in her thoughts. She had come here seeking answers, but Edward's presence had complicated everything. Late in the afternoon, Margaret was sent to the stables to deliver a message from the housekeeper. She walked briskly, eager to finish the errand and retreat back to the safety of the servants' quarters. But as she stepped into the cool shade of the stables, she froze. Edward was there, adjusting the saddle on his horse. He looked up at the sound of her footsteps and their eyes met. "Miss Margaret," he greeted, his voice calm but tinged with something she couldn't quite place. Margaret hesitated, clutching the envelope in her hands. "Your Grace," she replied, lowering her gaze. Edward took a step closer, his presence filling the space between them. "You always seem to appear when I least expect it," he said, a small smile softening his features. Margaret forced herself to meet his gaze, her heart pounding. "I was sent with a message for the stable master," she explained, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Edward nodded, though he didn't move away. "You intrigue me, Margaret," he said after a moment, his tone quiet but earnest. "There's a strength in you, a quiet resilience. I see it in your eyes." Margaret's breath hitched and she looked away, the weight of his words pressing down on her. "I'm just a servant, Your Grace," she said softly. "Nothing more." Edward frowned, his expression clouding with frustration. "Is that how you see yourself?" he asked, his voice low. "Because I don't. I see someone who carries more than she lets on, someone who is more than what this world tries to make her believe." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. "Your Grace," she began, her voice trembling. "Please don't. This can't—" Edward reached out, his hand brushing hers lightly. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a shock through her. "I don't care about what can or cannot be," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "I only know that I want to understand you, to know you." Margaret stepped back, her hand slipping from his. "You don't know what you're saying," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This, whatever this is, it's impossible." Before Edward could respond, Margaret turned and fled, her footsteps echoing in the quiet of the stables. Edward stood there watching her go, his chest tight with a mix of determination and longing. He didn't know how or why, but he was certain of one thing: he wouldn't give up on her. As Margaret returned to the servants' quarters, her hands trembling and her thoughts racing, she clutched her mother's journal tightly. The secrets she carried felt heavier than ever, and she knew that the storm building between her and Edward was one she could no longer avoid. The heavy clouds that hung over Wexley Manor seemed to mirror Margaret's turbulent thoughts as she sat in the corner of the servants' quarters, staring at the worn leather cover of her mother's journal. The words she had read a dozen times now swirled in her mind, carrying more weight with each passing day. Promises made in shadows rarely see the light. The connection between her mother's disappearance and the Wexley family felt closer than ever, but she couldn't yet piece together the fragments of truth that eluded her. And now Edward, his unrelenting presence, his probing questions, his ability to unsettle her carefully guarded resolve, had made everything infinitely more complicated. She closed the journal abruptly and tucked it beneath her mattress, as though hiding it from sight could also bury the doubts and emotions it stirred. She couldn't let herself be distracted. She had come to Wexley Manor with a purpose, and it didn't involve the Duke of Wexley and the way his gaze seemed to pull her in, as though he could see the parts of her she tried so desperately to hide. That morning, Lady Amelia summoned Margaret to her room with a request that left her breathless. "We're hosting guests for dinner tonight," Amelia said, her tone casual as she selected a gown from her wardrobe. "You'll join me as my companion, of course." Margaret's stomach dropped, and she stepped forward in protest. "My lady, I don't think it's appropriate for—" Amelia cut her off with a wave of her hand, her eyes sharp as she turned to face Margaret. "It's perfectly appropriate. You'll wear one of my gowns just as before. You'll sit beside me, smile when necessary, and say as little as possible. It's not up for debate." Margaret hesitated, torn between her sense of duty to Lady Amelia and the gnawing fear of being seen by Edward again. But she knew there was no arguing with Amelia when her mind was set. Hours later, Margaret stood before a mirror in Amelia's room, her reflection almost unrecognizable. The lavender gown she wore was elegant but understated, the soft fabric flowing gracefully as she moved. Her hair had been styled simply, with loose tendrils framing her face. As she stared at herself, she felt like an imposter, a maid pretending to be something she wasn't. The dining room was a vision of opulence that evening, the long table set with gleaming silver and crystal, illuminated by the soft glow of countless candles. Margaret followed Lady Amelia into the room, her heart pounding as she tried to blend into the background despite her fine attire. She had barely stepped inside when her eyes found Edward at the head of the table. He looked as regal as ever, his dark suit tailored perfectly to his broad frame. His gaze lifted, and their eyes met across the room. Margaret quickly looked away, but she could feel the weight of his attention as she moved to take her seat beside Amelia. Edward, however, couldn't tear his eyes from her. She was a vision, her quiet grace drawing him in like a moth to flame. He barely heard the polite chatter of his guests, his focus entirely on Margaret. There was something about her tonight, a vulnerability in her demeanor that made him want to protect her, even as he longed to understand her secrets. The dinner unfolded in a blur of polite conversation and the clinking of glasses, but Margaret barely tasted the food on her plate. She could feel Edward's gaze on her throughout the meal, and each glance sent her nerves spiraling. When the dessert course was served, Edward finally broke the silence that had stretched between them. "Miss Margaret," he said, his deep voice cutting through the chatter, "would you care to take some air in the garden after dinner?" Margaret froze, her fork halfway to her lips. The room seemed to go still, all eyes turning to her. She glanced at Amelia, who gave her a subtle nod of encouragement. Swallowing hard, Margaret forced herself to meet Edward's gaze. "Of course, Your Grace," she said softly, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. After the meal, Edward led Margaret out to the garden, the cool night air a welcome relief from the stifling atmosphere of the dining room. The gravel path crunched beneath their feet as they walked in silence, the distant hum of crickets filling the void. Margaret's hands were clasped tightly in front of her, her heart pounding with every step. "I must confess," Edward began, breaking the silence, "that I've found myself quite captivated by you, Miss Margaret." His words sent a shock through her, and she stopped in her tracks, her eyes wide as she turned to face him. "Your Grace," she began, her voice trembling, "I'm not sure what you mean." Edward stepped closer, his expression earnest. "You're unlike anyone I've ever met," he said. "There's a strength in you, a quiet dignity that sets you apart. I see it in the way you carry yourself, the way you look at the world. And yet, I can't help but feel that you're hiding something." Margaret's breath hitched, her mind racing as she tried to think of a response. "Your Grace, she began, but he interrupted her, his tone soft but insistent. "Please, Margaret, if there's something you wish to say, something you're holding back, you can trust me." The sincerity in his voice nearly broke her. For a moment, she considered telling him everything. About her mother, about the journal, about the secrets she had uncovered. But then she remembered the stakes, the consequences of letting him into her world. She shook her head, stepping back. "There's nothing to tell, Your Grace," she said firmly, though her voice betrayed her inner turmoil. Edward studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded, though she could see the disappointment in his eyes. "Very well," he said quietly. "I won't press you. But know this, I won't give up on you, Margaret. Whatever it is you're hiding, I'll wait for you to trust me." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them away, her resolve hardening. "Good night, Your Grace," she said softly before turning and walking back toward the manor, her steps quick and purposeful. Edward watched her go, his chest tight with frustration and longing. That night, as Margaret lay in bed, the weight of her secrets felt heavier than ever. She had come to Wexley Manor seeking answers, but now she found herself caught in a web of emotions she hadn't anticipated. And at the center of it all was Edward, a man who was slowly breaking down the walls she had spent years building. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Wexley Manor, casting delicate patterns on the polished floors. Margaret moved through the servants' hall with a measured pace, carrying a tray of linens to be laundered. Her thoughts felt heavy, her heart a conflicting tangle of duty and desire. She hadn't been able to shake Edward's words from the previous night. The quiet conviction in his voice, the way he'd told her he wouldn't give up on her. It stirred something deep within her, a flicker of hope she couldn't afford to indulge. As she approached the laundry room, she heard hurried footsteps behind her. Turning, she found Lady Amelia standing in the corridor, her expression unusually serious. "Margaret, I need to speak with you," Amelia said, her voice low. She gestured for Margaret to follow her into a quiet alcove away from the other servants. Once there, Amelia's sharp gaze softened, replaced by something that resembled concern. "I've heard whispers," Amelia began, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "Some of the staff have noticed how often Edward speaks with you, how often his eyes follow you." Margaret felt her stomach drop, her cheeks flushing with heat. "My lady, I assure you, I've done nothing to encourage." Amelia raised a hand to stop her. "I know, Margaret. I trust you. But you must be careful. These rumors, they can spread like wildfire, and not everyone will be as understanding as I am." Margaret nodded slowly, her chest tight with unease. "I understand, my lady," she said softly. But Amelia wasn't finished. "There's something else," she said, her tone dropping even lower. "I've also heard that Edward is looking into the family's old records. I believe he's trying to find answers about you." Margaret's eyes widened, her pulse quickening. "About me?" she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Amelia nodded, her expression unreadable. "I don't know what he hopes to find, but if there's something you're hiding, Margaret, you need to be prepared. Whatever secrets you're keeping, they may not stay hidden for long." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She had known her presence at Wexley Manor was a risk, but she hadn't anticipated Edward's growing determination to uncover the truth. Later that afternoon, Edward sat in his study, a stack of old ledgers and documents spread out before him. He had spent hours combing through the records, searching for any clue that might explain Margaret's presence in his life. His instincts told him there was more to her story, and he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that the answers were buried somewhere within his family's history. As he flipped through the pages of an old household ledger, a name caught his eye: Mary Henshaw. The entry was dated nearly 2 decades earlier, listing her as a governess employed by the Wexley family. Edward's brow furrowed. Henshaw. It wasn't an uncommon name, but something about it felt significant. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Could this Mary Henshaw be connected to Margaret? Meanwhile, Margaret found herself in the attic once more, her mother's journal open in her lap. She traced the faded handwriting with her fingertips, her heart aching as she reread the familiar passages. There were mentions of the Wexley family, glimpses of kindness, hints of conflict, and a growing sense of unease as the entries progressed. One line in particular stood out to Margaret. "There are secrets in this house, secrets that could destroy everything if they were brought to light." Margaret's grip on the journal tightened. Her mother had known something dangerous enough to make her disappear without a trace. And now Margaret was standing on the edge of the same precipice, caught between her search for the truth and the growing connection she felt with Edward. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Margaret returned to the servants' quarters, her thoughts heavy. She barely noticed the other maids whispering in hushed tones as she passed, their glances following her with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. It wasn't until one of them spoke that Margaret realized the subject of their gossip. "I heard the Duke asked about her again," one maid said, her voice carrying just enough for Margaret to hear. "He's taken quite the interest in her, hasn't he?" Another maid giggled. Imagine that, a maid catching the eye of a duke. It's like something out of a novel. Margaret's cheeks burned and she quickened her pace, her heart pounding. The rumors were spreading faster than she had feared. She knew she couldn't let this continue, but what could she do? She couldn't change the way Edward looked at her, the way he seemed drawn to her despite every barrier that stood between them. That evening, as the household settled into its nightly routine, Margaret found herself standing outside Edward's study, her hands trembling. She had told herself she needed to speak with him, to find a way to put an end to his pursuit of the truth. But now that she was here, the weight of what she was about to do felt almost unbearable. Taking a deep breath, she knocked softly on the door. A moment later, Edward's voice called out, "Come in." Margaret stepped inside, her gaze immediately drawn to him. He was seated at his desk, the lamplight casting warm shadows across his face. When he looked up and saw her, his expression shifted from surprise to something softer, more earnest. "Margaret," he said, rising from his chair, "I wasn't expecting you." She clasped her hands tightly in front of her, her nerves threatening to overtake her resolve. "Your Grace," she began, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I need to ask you to stop, whatever it is you're doing. Looking into my past, asking questions. It has to stop." Edward's brow furrowed and he stepped closer, his gaze searching hers. "Why?" he asked simply, his voice quiet but firm. "Why are you so afraid of what I might find?" Margaret hesitated, her throat tightening. "Because it won't change anything," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever you're looking for, whatever answers you think you'll find, they won't matter. I'm just a maid, Your Grace. Nothing more." Edward shook his head, his frustration evident. "You're not just anything, Margaret," he said, his voice laced with emotion. "You're extraordinary, and I can't ignore the feeling that there's more to you than you're letting me see. Please let me in. Let me help you." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes, but she forced them back, shaking her head. "I can't," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't let you, because if you knew the truth, you'd hate me, or worse, you'd pity me. And I couldn't bear that." Edward took another step closer, his expression softening. "I could never hate you, Margaret," he said, his voice gentle. "And I don't think I could ever pity you. But whatever it is you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone." Margaret's resolve crumbled, and she took a shaky step back. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't do this." Before Edward could respond, she turned and fled the study, the weight of her secrets threatening to crush her as she disappeared into the shadows of the manor. The morning air was sharp, carrying with it the faint chill of the changing season. Margaret moved quickly through the servants' quarters, keeping her head down as the hum of conversation buzzed around her. Whispers and glances followed her everywhere now, their curiosity and judgment like shadows she couldn't escape. The other maids had grown bolder in their gossip, their voices lowering to hushed tones only when she entered the room. Each word was a reminder that the fragile balance she had maintained was beginning to unravel. Edward, too, was feeling the strain of the past days. He sat in his study, his hand resting on a ledger he could barely focus on. His mind kept drifting back to Margaret, her words, her pain, and the walls she kept so firmly in place. The night she had come to him, pleading for him to stop his inquiries, had left him restless. He couldn't ignore her desperation, nor could he silence the voice in his heart that told him she was hiding something deeply important. He had tried to give her space, but his resolve was crumbling under the weight of his growing feelings and his relentless need for answers. The unease that had settled over Wexley Manor grew heavier as the morning wore on. Margaret was scrubbing the floors of the east wing when the housekeeper appeared, her expression stern. "Margaret," she barked, her voice sharp. "Come with me." Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and stood, her stomach sinking. The housekeeper's tone left no room for argument. She followed her through the quiet halls, her heart pounding with every step. They stopped in one of the smaller drawing rooms, where Lady Amelia and another member of the household staff were waiting. On the table between them sat a small silver brooch, its delicate design glinting in the sunlight streaming through the window. Margaret froze, her pulse racing. She recognized the brooch. It belonged to Lady Amelia, and Margaret had seen her wear it many times before. "Margaret," Amelia began, her voice calm but firm, "this brooch was found in your quarters this morning. Would you care to explain how it came to be there?" Margaret's breath caught, and she shook her head vehemently. "My lady, I swear I didn't take it," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know how it got there." The housekeeper's expression hardened. "Do you expect us to believe that?" she snapped. "It didn't simply walk there on its own. If you're trying to deny it, you'd best think again." Margaret's cheeks burned with a mix of anger and fear. "I'm not lying," she said firmly, her voice rising slightly. "I would never steal from anyone, least of all Lady Amelia." Amelia held up a hand to silence the housekeeper, her gaze fixed on Margaret. "Enough," she said quietly. She studied Margaret for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "I believe you, Margaret," she said finally, her voice steady. "But this is serious. Someone is trying to cause trouble for you, and we need to find out who." Margaret's shoulders sagged with relief, but the fear in her chest remained. She had no doubt that the brooch had been planted to discredit her, but by whom? And why? The housekeeper pursed her lips, clearly displeased with Amelia's leniency, but she said nothing. Margaret left the room feeling shaken, her thoughts racing as she tried to piece together the motives behind the accusation. The answer came later that afternoon, in the form of a cruel laugh echoing through the servants' quarters. Margaret rounded a corner and came face to face with Clara, one of the maids who had always looked at her with thinly veiled disdain. Clara was flanked by two other maids, their expressions smug and mocking. "Oh, look who it is," Clara sneered, crossing her arms. "The little thief who thinks she's better than the rest of us." Margaret's jaw tightened, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said evenly. Clara scoffed, stepping closer. "Don't play innocent," she said. "We all see how the Duke looks at you. You think you're so special, don't you? But you're just a servant, like the rest of us. And you need to be reminded of your place." Margaret's chest tightened with a mix of anger and humiliation. "You planted the brooch," she said, her voice steady but laced with fury. Clara smirked, her eyes glittering with malice. "Prove it," she said, her tone mocking. "No one will believe you." Before Margaret could respond, a familiar voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" Edward's voice was firm, and the maids immediately stiffened, their smug expressions faltering. He strode toward them, his gaze sharp as it flicked between the women. Margaret felt her heart skip a beat as his eyes settled on her. "Nothing, Your Grace," Clara said quickly, her tone suddenly sweet. "We were just having a conversation." Edward's jaw tightened, and he stepped closer, his towering presence silencing any further attempts at deceit. "A conversation," he repeated, his tone icy. It sounded more like an accusation. Clara opened her mouth to respond, but Edward held up a hand, silencing her. He turned to Margaret, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low. Margaret nodded, though her hands were trembling at her sides. "Yes, Your Grace," she said quietly. Edward's gaze shifted back to Clara, his expression hardening once more. "I won't tolerate this kind of behavior in my household," he said sharply. "If I hear so much as a whisper of bullying or false accusations again, there will be consequences." Clara's face paled, and she nodded quickly, her confidence evaporating. "Yes, Your Grace," she murmured, her voice barely audible. As the other maids scattered, Edward turned back to Margaret, his brow furrowed with concern. "You shouldn't have to endure this," he said softly. Margaret met his gaze, her chest tightening at the kindness in his eyes. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. But as she walked away, she couldn't help but feel that the storm was far from over. The truth she carried, the truth about her mother, about the Wexley family, was a weight that grew heavier with each passing day. And the closer Edward came to unraveling the mystery, the more dangerous her position at Wexley Manor became. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting Wexley Manor in hues of amber and crimson. Margaret stood in the kitchen, her hands moving mechanically as she scrubbed a pot, her mind far away from the mundane task. The day had passed in a blur since the confrontation with Clara, but the sense of unease still clung to her like a shadow. She couldn't shake the feeling that her time at the manor was running out, that the truths she had worked so hard to conceal were on the verge of spilling into the open. Edward, too, was restless. He paced the length of his study, his thoughts consumed by Margaret and the accusations that had been leveled against her. He couldn't ignore the way she had looked at him in the aftermath of the incident, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and quiet resignation. She was slipping further away from him, retreating behind the walls she had so carefully built. And yet he couldn't stop himself from wanting to tear those walls down, to uncover the truths she kept hidden. Summoning his steward, Edward made a bold decision. "I want to hold a gathering tomorrow," he said, his tone resolute. "A celebration for the staff and their families. It will be informal, but it's long overdue." The steward raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the request. "Very well, Your Grace," he said, bowing slightly. "Shall I make the arrangements?" Edward nodded, his thoughts already racing ahead. This would be his chance to create a space where Margaret might feel at ease, where she might let down her guard enough for him to reach her. The announcement of the gathering spread quickly through the manor, sparking a flurry of excitement among the staff. It was rare for the Duke to host such an event, and the promise of an evening of music, food, and camaraderie was met with eager anticipation. Margaret, however, felt a knot of dread form in her stomach. She couldn't imagine spending an evening in such close proximity to Edward, not after everything that had happened. But refusing to attend wasn't an option. Her absence would only draw more attention to her. The following evening, the manor's courtyard was transformed into a lively space filled with lanterns, tables laden with food, and the cheerful strains of a small band. The staff and their families mingled, their laughter and chatter filling the air. Margaret stood at the edge of the gathering, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as she watched the scene unfold. She had chosen a simple dress for the occasion, one that blended in with the crowd, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Her suspicions were confirmed when Edward approached her, his tall frame cutting through the crowd with ease. He was dressed less formally than usual, his coat and cravat replaced with a more casual jacket and open collar. The sight of him made Margaret's heart skip a beat, but she quickly pushed the feeling aside. "Miss Margaret," he said, his voice warm but tinged with concern. "I'm glad you came." Margaret managed a small smile, though her nerves were on edge. "It's a lovely gathering, Your Grace," she said politely, avoiding his gaze. Edward studied her for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly. "You don't have to call me that," he said quietly. "Not tonight. Just Edward will do." Margaret's eyes widened slightly, and she shook her head. "I couldn't possibly," she began, but he interrupted her with a gentle smile. "Please," he said, "just for tonight." She hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "All right, Edward," she said softly, the name feeling strange on her lips. He offered her his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. He led her through the crowd, stopping occasionally to greet guests and exchange pleasantries. Margaret felt acutely aware of the eyes following them, the whispers that undoubtedly trailed in their wake. But Edward seemed unfazed, his focus entirely on her. As they reached a quieter corner of the courtyard, Edward turned to face her, his expression earnest. "I've been wanting to speak with you," he said, his tone low. Margaret felt her pulse quicken, and she took a small step back. "Edward, please," she said, her voice trembling. Why won't you let me in?" He interrupted, his voice filled with quiet frustration. "Every time I try to get closer, you pull away. I don't understand, Margaret. What are you so afraid of?" Margaret's throat tightened and she shook her head, unable to meet his gaze. "You wouldn't understand," she said, her voice barely audible. "You can't understand." Edward stepped closer, his hand gently brushing against hers. "Then help me understand," he said softly. "Whatever it is, whatever you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone." The sincerity in his voice broke something inside her, and for a moment she considered telling him everything. The journal, her mother's disappearance, the secrets she had uncovered. But then she remembered the stakes, the danger of revealing too much. "I can't," she whispered, her voice cracking. I'm sorry, but I can't. Edward's expression softened, and he nodded slowly, though the pain in his eyes was clear. I won't press you, he said quietly. But know this, I'm here for you, Margaret, no matter what. The sound of the band striking up a lively tune broke the tension, and Edward stepped back, offering her a small smile. May I have this dance? He asked, his tone lighter but still filled with warmth. Margaret hesitated, then nodded, allowing him to lead her to the center of the courtyard. As they danced, the world seemed to fade away, the music and laughter blending into the background. For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt a fleeting sense of peace, a momentary reprieve from the weight of her secrets. But as the song ended and Edward's hand slipped from hers, the reality of her situation came rushing back. That night, as she lay in bed, Margaret stared at the ceiling, her heart heavy with the knowledge that her time at Wexley Manor was running out. The truths she had buried were rising to the surface, and she knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The soft patter of rain against the windows of Wexley Manor mirrored the storm brewing within Margaret. She sat alone in the attic, her mother's journal open on her lap, its pages worn from her constant handling. Tonight, the entries felt heavier, as if the ink itself carried the weight of her mother's despair. The cryptic references to promises, to the secrets hidden within the Wexley household, echoed in her mind like a warning. The words blurred as tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had been strong for so long, but with each passing day, the cracks in her resolve grew deeper. The rain drummed harder as the hours dragged on. Downstairs, Edward sat in his study, the fire crackling softly as he stared at a document spread across his desk. It was the household ledger from nearly 20 years ago, the one that listed the name Mary Henshaw. He had been poring over it for days, searching for any connection between this name and Margaret, but the answers eluded him. Frustration gnawed at him, not just because of the mystery, but because he could feel Margaret slipping further away. She had danced with him at the gathering, smiled at him even, but there was a distance in her eyes he couldn't breach. Edward's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Come in," he called, his voice heavy with fatigue. Lady Amelia entered, her expression unusually serious. "Edward," she began, her tone soft but firm. "We need to talk." He gestured for her to sit, but Amelia remained standing, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "It's about Margaret," she said, and Edward immediately straightened, his full attention on her. "What about her?" he asked, his voice cautious. Amelia hesitated, her gaze flickering to the fire before meeting his. "I've seen the way you look at her," she said quietly, "and I've seen the way she looks at you. But Edward, there's something you need to understand. Margaret didn't come to Wexley Manor by chance." Edward frowned, leaning forward. "What are you saying?" Amelia sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. "She's hiding something, Edward. I don't know what, but it's clear she has her reasons. And whatever those reasons are, they're tied to this house, to our family." Edward's mind raced. Margaret had always been a mystery, but hearing Amelia voice what he had long suspected made the pieces fall into place. He thought of the fear in Margaret's eyes whenever he got too close, the way she had begged him to stop looking into her past. He had thought it was because she felt unworthy, but now he realized it was something far deeper. The following morning, Edward made his way to the servants' quarters, his resolve unshaken. He found Margaret in the kitchen, her hands busy kneading dough for the day's bread. She looked up as he entered, her expression shifting from surprise to apprehension. "Your Grace," she said, quickly wiping her hands on her apron. "What brings you here?" Edward stepped closer, his gaze steady. "We need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Margaret hesitated, glancing at the other servants who had stopped to watch. "Here?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Edward shook his head. "No, somewhere private." Minutes later they stood in the small unused parlor at the back of the manor. Margaret wrung her hands nervously, her heart pounding as Edward closed the door behind them. "What is this about?" she asked, her voice trembling. Edward turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "It's about you," he said simply. Margaret's stomach dropped. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice faltering. Edward stepped closer, his gaze piercing. "Don't lie to me, Margaret. I know you came here for a reason, and I know it has something to do with my family." Tears pricked at Margaret's eyes, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. "Your Grace, please," she said, her voice cracking. "You don't understand." Edward's jaw tightened. "Then help me understand," he said. "Tell me the truth, Margaret. No more secrets." The room seemed to close in around her as Margaret struggled with the weight of her decision. She had spent months protecting her secrets, guarding them like a shield. But now, faced with Edward's unwavering determination, she realized there was no way forward without the truth. Taking a shaky breath, Margaret reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out the journal. "This belonged to my mother," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Edward took the worn leather book from her hands, his brow furrowing as he opened it. The faded handwriting filled the pages, each word carrying the weight of the past. "She worked here," Margaret continued, her voice trembling. "Years ago, before I was born. She was a governess for your family, but something happened. Something that made her leave and never come back. She never told me what it was, but I think it broke her." Edward's eyes scanned the pages, his heart sinking as he read the cryptic entries. One line in particular stood out. "They will never forgive me if the truth is revealed." He looked up at Margaret, his expression filled with a mix of sympathy and confusion. "What truth?" he asked gently. Margaret shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I don't know," she said, her voice breaking. "That's why I came here. To find out what happened to her, to understand why she left. But the more I've searched, the more I've realized that some secrets are meant to stay buried." Edward stepped closer, his voice soft but firm. "Margaret, whatever happened back then, it wasn't your fault. You don't have to carry this burden alone." She looked up at him, her tears blurring her vision. "But what if it changes everything?" she whispered. "What if the truth destroys everything we've built?" Edward reached out, gently brushing a tear from her cheek. "Then we'll face it together," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "Whatever the truth is, Margaret, it won't change how I feel about you." For the first time in months, Margaret felt a glimmer of hope pierce through the darkness. The truth was still a heavy weight on her shoulders, but now she realized she didn't have to bear it alone. The morning sunlight spilled through the tall windows of Wexley Manor, casting a soft golden glow over the corridors. Margaret stood outside the study, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure it echoed through the hall. In her hands, she clutched her mother's journal, its worn leather edges a reminder of the secrets it contained. The conversation with Edward the night before had left her vulnerable, but it had also planted a seed of courage she hadn't felt before. Today, she would face the truth. No more hiding, no more running. Inside the study, Edward waited, pacing the length of the room. He had spent the night reading and rereading the journal, the words filling him with equal parts sorrow and determination. The entries painted a picture of a woman who had been kind, intelligent, and devoted to her role in the household, but who had also carried the weight of a betrayal that seemed to stem from within the Wexley family. Edward's mind was consumed by the question, what had his father done to drive Margaret's mother to such despair? Margaret finally knocked, her fingers trembling. Edward's voice called her in, and she stepped inside, clutching the journal tightly to her chest. His eyes met hers, and she saw a softness there that steadied her nerves, if only slightly. "Margaret," he said, his tone calm but resolute. "I've been waiting for you." She nodded, her voice catching as she replied, "It's time, Your Grace. I need to know everything." Edward gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, her posture rigid with tension. "I've read the journal," he began, "and while much of it is cryptic, one thing is clear. Your mother believed someone in my family betrayed her. She mentioned my father more than once, though she never wrote exactly what happened." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I'm afraid there's only one person left who might know the truth." Margaret's brow furrowed. "Who?" she asked, though she suspected the answer. Edward met her gaze. "Lady Beatrice Wexley, my aunt. She was in charge of household affairs during that time, and she kept detailed records of everything. If anyone knows what happened to your mother, it's her." Margaret's breath hitched. She had seen Lady Beatrice only a handful of times, but the older woman had always exuded an air of stern authority that Margaret found intimidating. Still, this was her chance to finally uncover the truth. "Will she speak to me?" Margaret asked quietly. Edward hesitated, then replied, "If I ask her to, she will." Later that afternoon, Margaret and Edward made their way to the East Wing, where Lady Beatrice resided. The air felt heavy as they approached her private parlor, the echoes of their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Edward knocked lightly, and after a moment, a sharp voice called, "Enter." Lady Beatrice sat by the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her piercing eyes landed on Edward first, then shifted to Margaret, narrowing slightly. "Edward," she said coolly, "what is the meaning of this?" Edward stepped forward, his tone firm but respectful. "Aunt Beatrice, we need your help. There's a matter concerning Margaret's mother, Mary Henshaw, who worked here many years ago." Lady Beatrice's expression barely flickered, but Margaret noticed the way her fingers tightened slightly against the armrest of her chair. "Mary Henshaw," she repeated, her tone measured. "I remember her." She turned her gaze to Margaret. "And I assume you're her daughter?" Margaret nodded, her throat dry. "Yes, my lady," she said softly. Beatrice sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Mary was a good woman, one of the finest governesses we ever had. But her time here did not end well." She paused, her gaze growing distant. "There was an incident involving your mother and the late Duke, Edward's father." Edward stiffened, his jaw clenching. "What kind of incident?" he asked. Beatrice hesitated, then spoke slowly. "Your father made advances toward Mary. Unwelcome advances. She rejected him, of course, but when word got out, the household was in turmoil. Some believed her. Others believed your father's version of events, that Mary had tried to manipulate him for her own gain." Margaret's breath caught, her heart pounding as Beatrice continued. "Your father dismissed her to avoid further scandal, but the damage was done. Mary's reputation was ruined, and she left the manor under a cloud of shame." Beatrice's voice softened. "I wanted to help her, but your father forbade me from intervening. It was a cruel thing he did, and I've always regretted not doing more to stop it." The room fell silent, the weight of Beatrice's words pressing down on them all. Margaret felt a surge of anger and grief, her chest tight with the knowledge of what her mother had endured. Edward, too, looked stricken, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "I'm sorry, Margaret," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know." Margaret shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's not your fault," she whispered. "But now I understand why she was so broken. She carried this pain with her for the rest of her life, and she never told me because she wanted to protect me from it." Edward stepped closer, his hand gently brushing her shoulder. "You deserve to know the truth," he said. "And now that we do, I'll make it right. I don't know how yet, but I will." Lady Beatrice stood, her expression softening as she looked at Margaret. "For what it's worth, my dear, I am sorry for what happened to your mother. She deserved better." That evening, as Margaret stood in the gardens, the cool breeze drying the tears on her face, she felt an odd sense of peace. The truth had been painful, but it was a weight she no longer had to carry alone. Edward joined her, his presence a steadying force. "What will you do now?" he asked gently. Margaret turned to him, her gaze steady. "I'll honor her memory," she said. "I'll move forward, knowing the truth, and I'll make sure no one ever forgets her story." Edward reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "Whatever path you choose, Margaret, I'll be by your side," he said softly, "if you'll let me." Margaret looked up at him, her heart full for the first time in years. "I think I'd like that," she said, a small smile breaking through the lingering sorrow. As the stars began to fill the night sky, Margaret and Edward stood together, the past no longer a shadow between them, but a bridge that had brought them closer.